Hi, everybody. This is Stefani Ruper. Thank you for tuning in to the Meaning of Everything podcast, where we entertain truly revolutionary ideas. This is certainly the case today in episode number 21, as I have on Arie Kruglanski, an expert in the ways in which people make sense of things and specifically become close-minded and extremist. Now, today's episode is deeply humbling to me. I got very lucky earlier this week when I emailed one of my personal heroes, and he responded almost immediately and was happy to chat within just a few days, which sent me scrambling to hurry up and try and figure out precisely how I would go about chatting with him and what kinds of questions I would ask. And I am deeply honored to have him on today. Arie Kruglanski is really influential. I'm not the only person who has been influenced by him. He's been very influential in the field of psychology, and specifically in understanding the ways in which we make sense of things, whether we stay open-minded, when we become closed-minded, why that happens. He often talks about motivations. He says that we are thoughts. I ask him in the episode, which, by the way, I just recorded. I ask him in the episode if you can ever separate thought from feeling or from motivation, which is a question I spend a lot of time thinking about. And he said no. And I absolutely agree with him. And so he talks a lot about these motivations, these underlying compulsions that we have for significance and for answers that can lead to terrorism, that can lead to becoming extreme, having extreme viewpoints. And that's not just in a terroristic sense, but in our day-to-day lives, and can lead to close-mindedness and the kinds of polarization we're seeing in our political landscape today. And so this is all deeply relevant. I think probably one of the most pressing issues of the modern era, and why I personally have committed myself so intently to the study of uncertainty and the way in which it affects us. So today's podcast is deeply meaningful and humbling to me. And also Arie Kruglanski is not only brilliant, but incredibly warm and kind to me, as you will see in the interview. And so it's really great. I will read his bio really quickly so you understand a little bit of how I have been influenced by him and others as well. And then I'll jump right into it. Arie W. Kruglanski is a distinguished university professor, a recipient of numerous awards, and a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the American Psychological Society. He served as an editor on the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Attitudes and Social Cognition, editor of the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, and associate editor of the American Psychologist. These are all important journals. His work in the domains of human judgment and belief formation, the motivation-cognition interface, group and intergroup processes, and the psychology of human goals has been disseminated in over 300 articles, chapters, and books, and has been continuously supported by grants from a wide variety of institutes. He was one of the founding PIs, which is investigators, and co-directors of START, which is the National Center for the Study of Terrorism and the Response to Terrorism. In doing so, he conducts research with the support of grants from the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, on the psychological processes behind radicalization, de-radicalization, and terrorism. And he has also, this is not in the bio of his that I'm currently reading, he has studied and worked with the de-radicalization process in actual people moving away, coming out of terrorist groups. So he is richly experienced and knowledgeable. And so it is it's really wonderful to hear him speak. So I will go ahead and jump right into it. Here is Professor Arie Kruglanski. Perhaps we should just, why don't you tell me a little bit, if you don't mind, about sort of what you're doing and why you're doing it?
I'm studying at this point. I'm very interested in psychology of extremism writ large. I got to that topic from studying violent extremism, conflict regions in the world of the world. Studied extremists, terrorists, activists of various ilks, various sectors in Sri Lanka, in the Philippines, Morocco, in Syria. And I'm now trying to expand it to understand extremism in a larger sense. Because I believe that the core psychology of extremism is common. Extremism such as extreme sports, extreme diets, extreme fluctuations, addictions of various types, drug addictions, work addictions, video addictions, gaming addictions, shopaholicism. They seem to be strange bedfellows, but I believe that they share a psychological core in common that is this, at its foundation, not dissimilar from violent extremism. So that's the topic I'm particularly excited about these days. But I'm generally interested in all aspects of human psychology, particularly with the motivational aspects, because I believe that it's motivation that drives all psychological phenomena. It's not cognition. Cognition is the handmaiden of motivation. So we have to understand what motivates people and how motivation works in general.
This is a question that I've been wanting to ask you. I've been working a lot on the concept of objectivity, and I see it as an illusion that we think that our thoughts can be removed from our feelings. Is there any kind of thought that we can have that is ever not motivational?
I do not think so. Cognition is motivated. It can be motivated by the desire for the truth, by the desire for confidence, and to a very large extent by the desire to believe in good things, in things that we want to believe. We want to believe that we are healthy, that we are successful. We want to believe that we matter, that we deserve respect, that we are significant, as opposed to being just a speck of dust in an uncaring universe, as one philosopher put it. So these motivations carry our cognitions. And sometimes even bad news are accepted because the motivation for truth prevails. And the evidence is so deeply compelling that even our motivation to believe in things desirable isn't sufficient to overcome this motivation for truth. But in many cases, the motivation to believe in what we want to believe takes the upper hand, and we are deluded in various ways.
Right. And so what would you say that there has been some aspect of these motivations and the types of things that lend to extremism, right? Like, is that something that is culturally conditioned, right? Is it something that's a part more, we see it more in our world today than we might have in previous eras?
Yes, I think extremism is rooted in two basic motivations. One is the motivation for certainty, and in an uncertain, unpredictable, threatening universe, the motivation for certainty arises. And the second one is the motivation for significance, to feel that we matter. Once you combine these two motivations, you find that people become very vulnerable to extremist ideologies that have these two fundamental components. They are very clear-cut, they are Manichaean, they are black and white, us versus them, right versus wrong. So they provide certainty, and they provide a way for you to be significant. All you have to do is to fight for ISIS. All you have to do is to support Trump. All you have to do is whatever the ideology advocates, and that is going to make you a significant person. You're going to become a hero, a martyr, a good person leading a good life, virtuous life. So these two conjunctions lead to extremism. Moderation is more balanced. It's not committed to one thing. the great appeal of extremist ideology is that it's very simplistic. It identifies one thing that if you follow, you'll have respect and you'll have certainty, and your life is going to be orderly and meaningful.
Right. Right. So, okay. So does everybody have a need for certainty, or how does it vary across populations? Why do we have it?
As with, you asked two questions.
Yes.
Stefani.
Yes, I do.
What is it? And the second one is
okay. Well,
whether people vary.
Right.
So, all phenomena psychological are diverse. They vary across people, and they vary across situations, and they vary across cultures. So no two people are the same. No two people have the same desire for certainty. Some people are very intolerant of ambiguity. Some people are quite tolerant of ambiguity. And in fact, they prefer ambiguity over certainty because ambiguity allows them to remain uncommitted.
Mm-hmm.
So there are individual differences, but with all phenomena psychological, the same state that defines differences between people also defines differences across situations. Mm-hmm. So there can be a situation in which most people would desire certainty to a greater extent than in other situations. When there's turmoil, in times of war, in times of economic upheavals and unpredictability, most people desire certainty. This state of the world with economic recessions, with uncertainty about Europe, with the refugee crisis, with migration of unprecedented proportions, with coming together through globalization and through media, with a variety of a host of different ideas, there is great uncertainty that most people experience. Mm-hmm. So situation is another determinant of the quest for certainty. And of course, again, the third factor that influences certainty is your culture. Some cultures insist on order and certainty. For example, the German culture is higher than the Greek culture on the desire for order. Mm. The Germans would see the Greeks as rather uncoordinated, wishy-washy, all over the place. Ordnung muss sein in Germany. Japan would be similar. Some cultures are very insistent on certainty, and they induce the quest for certainty in their members. People in a given culture learn from childhood that certainty is a very important thing, order is a very important thing. Others are freer. The southern cultures, live and let live. So these three components, the individual makeup, maybe genetically determined, maybe determined by the culture of your home, the situation, whether the world seems to be unpredictable and threatening, and the culture in which you were brought up. And now you ask another question. Why do people need certainty to begin with? Mm-hmm. Certainty is an indispensable basis for action and decision-making. In order to cross a busy street, you have to be certain that no traffic is coming your way and that can endanger you, that can hurt you. So any decision that you make, you need a certain degree of certainty. If you had uncertainty, you would be paralyzed. You would be buried in thought. You would be paralyzed by overanalysis. So certainty is an essential epistemic concern that we need to have in every walk of life, anything that we do, any decision that we make. Therefore, nature endowed us with the possibility of becoming certain. We become certain not because objectively there is firm basis for certainty, but because psychologically we determine that enough information is enough, and we can proceed with deciding and acting. So that's a very basic epistemic component of our psychology, of our activity, of the way we conduct our lives. You need to have certainty to decide.
Now, the language that you and now in the literature we use around this sort of thing is cognitive closure, right? The craving for cognitive closure and to avoid it. And something I find interesting about your work is it seems as though most movements in psychology and many of the psychologists throughout the last several decades have focused on uncertainty as being a problem, and people definitely sort of characterizing humans generally as needing certainty. And you uniquely say, well, actually, people can need to avoid certainty. But also, my curiosity is, do people tend to lean towards certainty, than more so needing certainty more so than to avoid it? And why? Why does that bias exist in the psychological literature?
It's very difficult to determine whether they desire certainty more than uncertainty. It's easier to focus on certainty because, as I just mentioned, certainty provides the basis for action and decision-making. And insofar as decision-making and action make up our lives, our life is an interminable chain of decisions and actions. So it's to focus on certainty. But sometimes uncertainty is also important, especially if you want to be absolutely sure, absolutely truthful, absolutely have a safe proof notion that you're correct. So if correctness is something that you worry about, you are going to delay certainty. At some point, you've got to decide, although some people are pathological in that respect and never decide. But in most cases, you end up deciding, and maybe that's the bias towards certainty. But I think it's important to understand why people may desire uncertainty, and that's when they want to be, very, very faithful to whatever evidence there is, when they are want to be perfectionistic and not ignore anything that could be relevant, when they do not want to commit to anything before it's absolutely necessary. These people will be more tolerant of uncertainty. They will be more wishy-washy, less sanguine about their views. There are interesting differences in that regard between conservatives and liberals. Conservatives are more committed to certainty. They're clearer. Their commitment to whatever it is, their group, their political party, their president, is much more definite than liberals. Liberals are tolerant of all kinds of things and then therefore become wishy-washy. If you recall John Kerry's flexibility, I was first for the war before I was against it. This kind of openness, which in some sense is laudable and positive, it's at the same time wishy-washy, and it's more characteristic of some people, liberals versus conservatives, some cultures versus other cultures. So, it's important to understand that continuum as opposed to saying people in general like X. People are different, situations are different, cultures are different, and it's important to understand these dimensions on which those differences exist.
Why do you have any hypotheses about why the need for certainty and the obsession with having an ordered, certain world has increased or seems to be predominant in America generally, or the West generally today?
Well, I think because there have been changes. I mentioned the migration crisis, the economic debacle, the recession of 2008 introduces a great deal of uncertainty into people's lives.
Yeah.
The technological development, of which some segments of the population participate more than others, creates these inequalities, these differences. People are frightened. They cannot participate in globalization. They cannot jet around the world. They feel left behind. So that introduces a great deal of uncertainty. The world, the liberal democratic order that existed for the last 75 years from the end of Second World War on seems to be crumbling. There's a great population movement. All of that introduces a great uncertainty, great strangeness. Foreigners are sweeping the land. They are threatening. They are different. And therefore, you have the propensity to find clear-cut extremist ideologies that demarcate us versus them. They're threatening immigrants. And, rational arguments to say that, even though immigration increased, unemployment decreased, so it's not the case that immigrants threaten employment. That has nothing to do with it. There is a psychological fear of strangeness, fear of foreignness, the uncertainty that is being introduced. So the world right now is very much an uncertain place, and you see these extremist, populist, simplistic movements springing up everywhere. You have fundamentalist Islam that breeds terrorism all over the Muslim world. ISIS is not defeated. ISIS just morphed into a shadowy organization that has its tentacles all over the planet. In Eastern Europe, you have the resurgence of nationalism. In the United States, you have polarization. You have our president, who is populist on one side, and you have the leftist populist on the other side. All of which expresses this desire for clear-cut ideas. The banks are to be blamed. When the panacea is the Green New Deal. Whatever the idea is, if it's simple, if it's promising, over-promising some good things, it's going to be very attractive.
Right, because if we have a higher need for certainty, then it becomes less easy to hold open-mindedness, right? And it becomes much more easy to be influenced by the kinds of information that comes immediately or that is emotionally, right, that is fraught with emotion, and especially, as you mentioned, that might lend you significance, right? So we become more susceptible to being persuaded quickly, right?
Exactly right. Because persuasion and cognition, as we said, is driven by motivation. It's not that we are really responsive to arguments in any objective sense of the word. We are responsive to arguments that correspond to our motivations. And if you want certainty, an argument that promises certainty is going to be more palatable. An argument, if you fear about your standing in the world, your significance, your mattering, an argument that tells you, we'll make America great again, we'll make Americans great again, you're an American, we'll make you great again. Well, that sounds very good for a person who is threatened concerning their sense of mattering and significance.
Right. And actually, slogans like Make America Great Again are very interesting to me because in some ways, I think they create the need for certainty in the first place, right? They sort of imply that there's something that needs to be fixed or imply that there's something wrong. And so often the types of propaganda that are really powerful are the ones that don't just provide you with significance and certainty, but also make you believe that it's more necessary.
You're so right. You're right on target. The narratives both activate the need and advocate a way of meeting that need. And for example, in terrorist ideologies, the communicators like Abu Yahya al-Libi, Osama bin Laden, Musab al-Zarqawi, all of these great communicators of terrorism, first evoke the need. They say, you know, Muslims are being slaughtered, their children are going to be killed, their women are going to be raped. And you as a Muslim, even though you may reside in the UK, you may be a scion of a wealthy family, you may be even admitted to a medical school, your life seems to be going well, but as a Muslim, you have been terribly humiliated, and therefore you need to leave everything behind, go to Syria, and join ISIS. So the narrative both activates the need and advocates a way of meeting that need. So absolutely.
And these types of things, they're sort of, you know, we're talking about extremism currently, and they happen. There are these foundations in terrorism, but we also encounter them on a day-to-day basis, right? You mentioned addiction, you mentioned, right? And so what is it that people can do, right? So you've actually worked with people who have been involved with terrorist movements, right? And sort of seen processes of de-radicalization. And so it's possible to ratchet down our needs for certainty, right? And sort of create a calm or pro-social space for us to live in?
It is in principle. It is in principle. From a psychological perspective, we know what needs to be done. Extremism is promoted by a motivational imbalance. You know, there has been a long-standing argument about terrorism, whether it's a pathology or whether it's a normal type of behavior. And initially, in the 70s and the 80s, psychiatrists were proposing that it must be some kind of psychology, maybe narcissism, maybe paranoia. But the evidence accumulated that this is not the case, that terrorism is a part and parcel of normal behavior, has to be understood as a normal type of behavior. And the pendulum swung the other way, that anybody can become a terrorist. You and I could become a terrorist. Mother Teresa, I mean, taking it ad absurdum, Mother Teresa could become a terrorist. Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King could become terrorists. That doesn't make sense either. So the question is not whether anybody could become a terrorist and whether it's totally normal, but what are the circumstances under which somebody could become an extremist? And we have come to the conclusion that it has to do with the motivational imbalance. People have several different basic needs: relatedness, autonomy, competence, self-esteem. Psychological theorists identify these needs, and of course biological needs for nutrition, for hydration, for rest. These are basic needs. But when and mostly people want to satisfy all those basic needs, and these needs constrain one another, so that if a behavior came up that was satisfying one need but was inimical to other needs, that behavior would tend to be avoided. But when one needs become dominant and the other needs recede, we have only a limited amount of psychic energy. If all our energy is put into one thing, all the other needs tend to recede, tend to be suppressed, then the constraints that they exert on behavior, moral considerations, normative considerations, relatedness considerations, they all are pushed aside, and you concentrate on this one basic need, and then anything goes, because the constraint, so you can leave your family, you can neglect your career, you can neglect your empathy to other human beings, and that allows you to carry out extreme acts in service, on altar of that one thing. So it's not that, and this is an abnormal state in the sense that most people want to satisfy all their needs. So that's why terrorists are a minority. Extremists in all kinds of extremism are a very small percentage of the population. Mm-hmm. Video addictions, 2% of the population. Even shopaholism, it's very easy with a credit card to be a shopaholic. it's only about 5% of the population, terrorists, even smaller percent of the population, and it's not very enduring because those other needs assert their importance. So to combat extremism of any kind, there are two basic ways. One is to identify a different means, because a means that is not frustrating those other concerns. So, for example, if you want to be significant, you could be a terrorist, but you also could be a respectable professional, right? So if you identify that, for example, in our work on the radicalization in Sri Lanka, and in many other cases, the programs provide alternative means to significance. Professional training, vocational training, creating situations where a person can be a contributing member of society as an alternative to violence. And the other way of reducing extremism is to evoke those other needs, to evoke relatedness, to evoke concern with family, to evoke empathy, and so forth. And many terrorists who leave their profession after years tell you that it was very difficult, the sacrifice of other needs. Not having a family, not having children, not having a profession is very, very difficult and trying. So it kind of wears out, the commitment wears out. And people, membership in gangs, membership in neo-Nazi organization lasts on the average about 10 years, no more. It's a province of the wild youth. Terrorists and extremists are usually young. When other concerns assert their importance, they tend to leave.
You mentioned, that's all so fascinating and important. You mentioned how stress can impact us, and uncertainty in a sense is a stress. And so it's the case, is it the case that when there's more uncertainty, or when you're more stressed under almost any variety of circumstances, right? I think in the literature, there's time constraints, and when you have multiple things on your mind, right? And so it's really important to pay attention to how stressed out or burdened you might be, because it can increase your tendency to these kinds of behaviors, right?
Absolutely. You just mentioned things that impinge on one's psyche and limit one's ability to channel resources to thinking and deliberation. And under those conditions, when you're stressed for time, when there is noise, when there is uncertainty, when there are other needs that race through your mind, you don't have energy to weigh things in a cool, deliberate way. And at that point, certainty becomes very attractive. And of course, then the extremist, simplistic, populist narratives become very appealing because they provide certainty.
Do you think, what is your opinion on how the internet and our access to internet media of all sorts impacts this question of extremism and our need for certainty?
Well, it bombards us with barrage of information that is very diverse, and it augments the uncertainty. Anything is possible. It occupies your time, so it leaves less time for other pursuits. It is a source of stress on the one hand. On the other hand, you can find similarly minded others. So you can create enclaves, groups that support your extremism. So it has multiple impacts that are not yet very well understood. But I think that it definitely changes the equation. It introduces a lot of noise. It introduces a possibility to polarize, to participate in a fraction of society as opposed to society at large. It allows fragmentation.
Mm-hmm. But so this whole question, I think it poses a real challenge to policymakers and communicators, because unfortunately these messages that are simplistic and populist can be really appealing to us, especially in times of uncertainty. And if what we need is nuance, right? If what we need is to be able to understand the complexity of ideas, it's very hard to package them in a way that will actually reach people, that will get likes on Facebook or something, or be voted on, right? And have a candidate be endorsed. And so is there a solution to this question of, can we hold complexity in that space?
Well, I think governments first have to have the will to control these media and reduce whatever threat they create to tolerance of complexity and open-mindedness. And governments are beginning to try to exercise control over the media, while at the same time using the media to their purposes. So it's a double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. The trolls, the boats, and the rest of it can be very effectively used for policy. As with any other tools, it can be used in many different ways, and we still have to find, as societies, a way of dealing with it, dealing with the invasion of privacy, the susceptibility to false information, susceptibility to attempts to manipulate us, cyber threats, cyber terrorism. These are still very novel things that need to be addressed, and we still do not know what exactly is the right way to deal with it. Mm. We live in a very interesting world where the multiplicity of information that we're bombarded with, and the uncertainty about the truth of the information, the idea of fake news, alternative realities, creates a situation where trust in established institution is waning. And we have to find the little fraction of our tribe, our friends that support us, because the general societal institutions no longer enjoy trust. We do not trust the government. We do not trust the Congress. We do not trust, we see that the Supreme Court is politicized. We do not trust the church, the Catholic Church, with all its excesses. We do not trust science. The replication crisis, the idea that scientists make up data. So that creates a kind of a situation of postmodernism run amok. Postmodernism, of course, denied the idea of truth. And now, whereas at one time it was the province of philosophers who debated these issues over coffees in nice cafes, now it seems to be a spread out reality that all people partake of, and it creates fragmentation. You have to find the people who you trust, and usually it's the very close ones, your family, your tribe. Society is kind of falling apart because of distrust.
Why? I know that this is a massively complex question, but is there a general, I know you mentioned postmodernism. Is postmodernism in a sense to blame for this loss of trust? Is it the way the media has developed, or corruption in government? Like, is there something fundamental underlying how so much of our trust has dissipated?
Well, I don't know to what extent postmodernism as a philosophical discipline or philosophical debate has had impact on society at large.
Yeah, I agree.
But, there has been a debate between, for example, science and creationism, and this idea of using false news through the internet, the bots, the idea that anything can be denied, that I think in part it was that we were too comfortable. At some point, we wanted cohesion, we wanted trust. Following Second World War, in the height of modernism, there was a great desire to trust society, to trust our institutions, to be optimistic. And we got very comfortable and started disrespecting the gift of trust and deviating from it in many different ways. Technology, of course, allowed a whole new possibility of spreading falsities and the idea that anything can be denied and there is no absolute way of proving anything, that everything rests on trust. Science rests on trust. That's a postmodernist idea, but now it seems to have spread so widely that it threatens society. And I think we just had this stability, this post-war security and stability, and we got too comfortable, and we started deviating. We started exploring alternatives, and the result is the current state of disintegration. And I hope it doesn't take another cataclysm.
Yeah.
That would bring us all back together and increase our desire for cohesion and shared reality.
Yeah, that's actually something I've worried about for a very long time. Humans don't seem to carry those kinds of memories forward as much as would be productive. I've always had the sense that countries like Germany and Japan, right, they have a more entrenched memory of what happened in the Great Wars, and Americans, have sort of been in this bubble of complacency for decades.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Bubble of complacency. That's a
very
adequate term.
Thank you. Yeah, and so in a sense, you were talking about institutions that require trust, and I feel like democracy in itself really requires trust, right? Because you have to make up your own mind, and in a sense, in a world that's uncertain, that can be really stressful, especially with all the media and stuff that we're exposed to.
Yes, so you have to trust somebody. You have to trust your candidate. You have to trust your government. You have to trust the system. Trust is in very short supply these days. We can talk about Bowling alone in his famous work. But since the time that his book was published, trust has declined even further. The Congress, the politicians, the presidency, I mean, you name it, and there's just a lack of trust. And in the good old 50s, everything seemed to, things were not good, but I think there was a sense that the world is an orderly place and you can trust your government. If they declare war, it's a good war. If they declare economic stringency, it's okay. You're willing to, think of what you can do for your country. But now it seems that every communicator can be questioned and held in suspicion.
Yeah, we have this hyper individualistic, right? We have this hyper individualistic culture, and I have often wondered, about that subjectivism. Yes. And now also, it's sort of ironic because we have this need for significance.
Yes.
And we take it and we turn it into something that's nowadays, right? We get to take selfies and post them on social media and sort of build our significance, but it's so isolated and so separated from, other ways of doing things in more collectivist cultures or ones where they have more trust. I find it worrying, and also fascinating that we're sort of trying to create our own significance, which is at the same time creating for us a different kind of need, or a different kind of need for significance that isn't being met.
Right. Yeah. We create our own significance through selfies. We communicate with our small group of friends. And those larger things that unite society are kind of left alone. Yes, and it's very true in an individualistic society. But I think in an individualistic, materialistic society like ours, the inequalities promote a great loss of significance in whole segments of population that feel left behind. And, this is a well-known argument that this feeds populism. And I think it's very apparent all over the Western world.
Mm-hmm.
And in other parts of the world, it's the appeal of extremist versions of ideology, of religion. You talked about religion, right? Religion can be twisted to support all kinds of violent behavior.
Do you have any ideas about what can be done about it?
Well, as a psychologist, I think I understand what needs to be done about it.
Mm.
But the world is not going to be saved by psychologists. You need to have political willpower. You need to have the ability to implement policies that would create alternatives. You have to understand that migrants and refugees, if they are maltreated, they will be drawn to radical ideas. And there is plenty of narratives that would be appealing to them. If you mistreat them, if you offend the religion, there will be consequences. Yes, freedom of speech is wonderful, but you've got to understand that it's a game of truth or consequences. Sometimes it's important not to say what happens to be on your mind and be considerate of others. Policies have to be implemented to understand the psychology of people, that terrorism is not going to be resolved by military force alone. So there has to be a political willpower to implement psychological ideas. We as psychologists understand what to do. And there are some enclaves. For example, I'm working now in collaboration with the Aarhus group in Denmark, who use psychology to prevent violent extremism, to prevent radicalization, to de-radicalize returning foreign fighters. And that rests on collaboration of the whole community, the police, the social services, the religious institutions, all work together. A model like that, if it could be implemented in other places, if trust to police could be increased, then we could create alternative networks, alternative narratives that would address people's need for significance. So we understand what needs to be done, how to translate it, how to instill the political will of governments and officials to implement these ideas. That's a huge challenge. Politics is local and politics is short-lived. You're elected for a number of years. These long-term solutions that psychologists understand need to be implemented may not be very appealing to somebody who wants to promise that within 10 years, everything is going to be solved.
Yeah. Yeah, I have often thought that we need to foreground an understanding of how humans function in our policy, right? Because that's the way we will be able to create successful policy. But it's really remarkable how little that is actually ever done. Yes.
And we have to understand that, some things are intrinsically appealing and they can be misused. the appeal of certainty, the appeal of simplistic arguments, the appeal of violence. Violence as a means of significance is a primordial phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
That's how animals settle their disputes. That's how little children from age 1 to 3 solve their conflict. That's how sophisticated nations attain their place in the international pecking order by having nuclear power, denying it to others. So, violence has an intrinsic appeal, and to understand it and to divert people away from it requires a lot of sophistication, psychological sophistication, and the willpower to do it, the kind of moral resolve, understanding that violence, even though it may serve your interest in the short term, is going to be destructive in the long term. And, long term is not something that many politicians appreciate, because their careers are short term by definition.
Right. And we once, I think it was really easy at one time to believe in this narrative of progress, right? That everything would be getting better and we're becoming more reasonable and more ethical and all of these sorts of things. But it's very important to remember that it's amazing that we have managed to build a society the way that we have, but it could vanish really easily when circumstances change, as we see that happen all the time.
I think it can. I think, there are some esteemed colleagues like Pinker who point out to the fact that violence and aggressiveness decreased significantly over the centuries and even over the last century. But I think that to believe that this is necessarily going to continue is probably a mistake, especially with the great advancement in destructive technologies, nuclear power that can be abused, the possible proliferation, it falling to the hands of fanatics. These are all possibilities that can, bring the world to the brink of destruction one more time. And, the possibility of a third world war or some kind of cataclysm is ever present because, the human nature has not changed. And culture can also devolve from more positive, tolerant, progressive ideas back to the middle, to the dark ages. That's our potential as human beings. And that creates a lot of danger that needs to be understood.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm not sure if I have any more questions. I have one more somewhat personal question, if you don't mind, and then I'll let you run. Okay. So I actually, this is taking a departure from where we've been. I happen to be one of the people who is a little pathologically afraid of certainty. And that's because of my commitment to truth and to open-mindedness. And so I'm wondering if how you might personally decide, or if you have any ideas, right? Like, how do we decide once we've learned enough? How do we make up our minds comfortably and move forward?
It's going to be determined by your motivation. In some cases, you probably are quite ready to make a decision. I assume that you have no problem crossing the street.
Correct. Usually.
Usually. You might have a bit more of a problem choosing a meal at a restaurant.
That is correct.
You might even have a greater uncertainty concerning things that really, really matter.
Yes, the greatest, of course.
The greatest. So, it depends on the situation, depends how important things are to you. It probably also depends on your personal state of mind. I find myself being less tolerant of alternative opinions when I'm very tired. Because I don't want to I'm not inclined to mobilize my energies to dealing with differences, dealing with alternative ideas. So, it all depends on your motivations. I don't think that you can, all you can do, Stefani, is be aware of your own psychology on a meta-psychological level. Yes. And understand that what you're doing now, not reaching a decision, is because you are motivated for the truth and for perfection, perhaps. And maybe that will help you understand that you could more comfortably reach a decision and choose a salad.
Yeah, and this is something that I think you've argued before is important for all of us to do, is understand that we can be persuaded in this way and sort of know where we fall on this spectrum.
Know thyself. Yes, I think that could help you understand that it's not some objective reality, but rather it's your psychological makeup that determines the way you feel and you think.
Yeah.
Need for significance. Somebody said you've got to control your pride, because otherwise your pride will control you. Understanding your makeup, understanding your quest for significance, understanding that the way you feel so offended when or so terrible when you fail is because you have this quest for significance, and maybe it can be mitigated a bit. Know thyself.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I know you have to run, so I'll let you go. This has been really, really good for me. So I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It's been fun talking to you.